I have a Roman Catholic background, baptism and conversion in Foursquare Church, so charismatic. Christianity, educated in Assemblies of God, Pentecostalism, youth pastored in the Pentecostal church with my wife, and then the Lord opened my eyes to the Reformation. So the issue of Catholicism or Catholicity, very important for me. So our topic, as you see in the handout, is a phrase from the Canons of Dort, the third and fourth point of doctrine, the ninth rejection. So lots of sort of sub-layers there. For the early church already condemned this doctrine long ago in the Pelagians. So I want to explore some continuities for a few minutes at least between Synod of Dort, third and fourth point of doctrine, which is on sin and conversion, and also how they tied into one of the early Catholic, some minor local council, the Synod of Council of Orange in 529. So in that fifth point of doctrine or later on, the fifth point of doctrine on perseverance, preservation of the saints, at the end of Article 15, the canons make this bold claim, quote, "The bride of Christ has always loved this teaching very tenderly and defended it steadfastly as a priceless treasure." Don't tell Jay Collier that the canons say that, right? So that statement invites a critical assessment of broader historical, theological context of the whole set of articles, rejections that make up what's called the canons of Dort. In a word, want to think about this question: are the canons Catholic? To narrow the focus, we'll come to this third and fourth point of doctrine, the ninth rejection, as a test for Catholicity. Does the bride of Christ actually love this teaching? And this ninth rejection is rejecting the errors of remonstrants, or today we'd call them Arminians, who teach that grace and free choice are concurrent, partial causes which cooperate to initiate conversion, and that grace does not precede, in the order of causality, the effective influence of the will. That is to say, that God does not effectively help the human will to come to conversion before that will itself motivates and determines itself. And then it says that line, "For the early church already condemned this doctrine long ago in the Pelagians on the basis of," and it goes on to cite several texts. So that's sort of a quick little synopsis where we're at. I want to think Catholicity in the Canons of Dort. So what's the state of the question? In a letter dated March 7, 1619, John Young, who was the Dean of Winchester Cathedral, wrote back to Samuel Ward at the Synod of Dort in the Netherlands. Ward had written a letter requesting of King James that he would approve Ward and the British delegates, quote, "desire that in the Synod's canons they would have a special eye to the definitions of ancient councils against the Pelagians." Young said that King James would write a letter to the ambassador to that effect. So the very next day, in fact, there's another letter from the Secretary of State, Sir Robert Naunton. He reflected the king's wishes in a letter to Sir Dudley Carleton, who was ambassador to the United Provinces in the Netherlands. And he says this, quote, "I received new directions from His Majesty that the conclusions against the remonstrance concerning Christ's death and the application of it unto us may be couched in manner and forms as near as possibly they may be to those which were used in the primitive church by the fathers of that time against the Pelagians and semi-Pelagians, and not in any new phrases of the modern age." Interesting. So that leads to the state of the question: to which definitions, to which ancient councils of the fathers of the early church were the British delegates and the synods in that third and fourth point of doctrine, ninth rejection, referring? So definitions, councils, fathers, early church. Furthermore, what was the reference in that article to this doctrine? This doctrine has been condemned long ago. So what are the councils? What's the doctrine that they are referencing as being condemned by the early church? And so third and fourth point of doctrine, you'll have it memorized, right? Canons of Dort. I mean, we all got it memorized. It's internalized. The rejections of errors. We all know exactly which remonstrant author said which rejection, right? Ninth rejection, third point of doctrine, sort of a window into exploring Dort's claim to Catholicity. So here's the thesis that I want to think about for now 15 minutes. Far from being a Reformed distinctive, Dort's doctrine of sin and grace in its third and fourth point is a faithful appropriation and application of ancient Augustinian Catholicity as expressed at the Council of Orange. So, definitions, councils, fathers, those phrases from those letters and from the canons themselves. So, to which council or councils, definitions were they referring? Clearly, the divines at Dort were aware of and conversant with ancient Augustine, Pelagius debates and doctrines. 8 times throughout the articles and rejections of the canons of Dort, 8 times we read about Pelagius, read about Pelagian or Pelagianism 8 times. Just as an example, in the first point of doctrine on predestination, the Synod rejected, quote, that in election to faith, a prerequisite condition is that humans should rightly use the light of nature, so reason, be upright, unassuming, humble, and disposed to eternal life. And the response to that error was that the CRC, the 2011 CRC translation says, for this smacks of Pelagius. The smacks of Pelagius. And the word there is that it tastes, savors of Pelagius. So if we were to retranslate it into modern parlance for our parishioners, if it walks like a duck, right? If it acts like a duck, it is a duck, right? So this sounds like, this tastes like, this savors, this smacks of ancient Pelagianism. Later on, in the second point of doctrine on the death of Christ, the Synod rejected the teaching that Christ, quote, only acquired for the Father the authority or plenary will to relate in a new way with humanity and to impose such new conditions as he chose, and that the satisfying of these conditions depends on human free choice. According to Dort, this summoned back from hell the Pelagian error. So again, referencing Pelagius in terms of election, predestination, the death of Christ. And then into the third and fourth points of doctrine, the second article says, the Synod asserts that the corruption of sin spread by God's just judgment from Adam and Eve to all their descendants, except for Christ, not by way of imitation, as in former times the Pelagians would have it. So they're conversant with, obviously, as Western Christians, these debates between Augustine and Pelagius. And we'll come back to that third and fourth, ninth rejection just a minute, so I'll skip that for a second. So some background then. They're conversant. Well, what's going on in that background? Pelagius flees to North Africa in the year 409. Alaric invades Rome, and he's shocked by the pessimism of Augustine in his own backyard. So this pessimistic view about human nature, and emblematic, of course, was that prayer in the Confessions, give what you command what you will. And Augustine records Pelagius' response. He says, quote, Pelagius could not bear these words, and contradicting somewhat too excitedly, nearly came to a quarrel with him who had mentioned them. So to summarize Pelagius, the keystone of Pelagius' whole system is the idea of unconditional free will and responsibility. After the fall even, Pelagius rejected the idea that man's will has any intrinsic bias in favor of wrongdoing. So that's some of the background quickly. Some of these issues of Augustine, Pelagius, grace, will, sin, and so forth were dealt with in a local council in 418, Council of Carthage, under Augustine himself. There were 8 canons or 8 rules that were that anathematized various views, and I'll just summarize 2 of them. Canon 4 says that whoever says the same grace of God through Christ helps us only in not sinning by opening to our understanding the commandments so that we may know what to seek, to avoid, and also love to do, but that through it we are not helped so that we are able to do what we know we should do. And then the fifth canon says that whoever says the grace of justification was given to us only that we might be able more readily by grace to perform what we were ordered to do through our free will, although not easily, we could without grace fulfill the divine commands. Although Jesus said, without me ye can do nothing. And that John 15 gets quoted in the canons themselves multiple times. So at the Canon, Council of Carthage, there are these various issues of will, grace. What is grace? What does grace do? How does it operate in the will? How does the will cooperate or not cooperate? How does it move the will to do the things that God commands? This debate continued for 100 more years, especially in monasteries in southern Gaul, modern France. The most formative of these ancient church councils that dealt with these issues was also a local council in 529, July 3rd, 529, the Second Council of Orange. There was a church that was dedicated by the prefect of this region, and various bishops gathered. I believe there were 14 bishops that gathered to dedicate this church. And, oh, by the way, while we're here, we might as well anathematize these monks, right? We might as well go after them, you know? We're here, might as well do something with their time, right? So Orange lists off 25 canons, these little heads of doctrine, and there's a little concluding confession of faith. The first 8 of these canons reject semi-Pelagian errors, drawing from the writings of Ignatius of Marseille, and then there's another set of articles that reject other semi-Pelagian errors. And I should mention the phrase itself, semi-Pelagian, is anachronistic. Irena Bacchus has written on this, so but just using them for simplicity's sake. There are various other articles from the writings of Prosper of Aquitaine, and mostly they're just citing from a list of statements from Augustine. There are these sort of lists that are circulated around of Augustine statements. And there's a final conclusion that summarizes the whole thing. Just to move ahead a little bit, 8 minutes, right? 8 minutes. All right. I don't want to go long, right? Because I heard that some people went long yesterday and got in trouble. I don't want to have the floor fall out from underneath me. So the Dortian fathers were aware of these debates. These debates discuss will, grace, and so forth. In the various judgments of the delegations to the Synod, there are various references in the margins to Augustine and Prosper, some medieval sources and whatnot. So we know that they were aware of these ancient councils. John Davenant, in one of his writings, although it was 1650, on the death of Christ, references the Council of Orange twice in his treatise on the death of Christ. He responds to the remonstrant view. So this is after the Synod, but it's reflecting his knowledge. He says he's rejecting the view that God's giving or denying grace depends on human will. And he says, quote, almost all the distinctions in the councils against the Pelagians will be set aside. They oppose the decrees of the Council of Orange, Canon number 4. And then he responds to an objection to his own view, which said his view was semi-Pelagian, because he said that God was both so pacified in the death of Christ that he's ready to receive any who repent and believe, but at the same time, the same God does not produce in all the condition of faith. And so some said this sounded semi-Pelagian. He says this, quote, we do not therefore join the semi-Pelagians, but we say with the Arauskian fathers, the fathers of Orange, Canon 6, if anyone says that the mercy of God is bestowed upon those that believe, will, desire, and knock without the grace of God, and does not confess that it is through the divine power that we believe and will, by the infusion and inspiration of the Holy Spirit in us, he opposes the saying of the apostle, by the grace of God, I am what I am. So they were aware of this. These ancient councils, in various ways, we can see that in their writings. This doctrine was condemned. So what's the this doctrine in particular in that third and fourth point of doctrine that they're rejecting that links back to the Council of Orange? So again, that rejection number 9 is a window into the Catholicity of the mindset of the Dortian fathers. Again, they're rejecting this remonstrant doctrine, quote, that grace and free choice are concurrent partial causes which cooperate to initiate conversion. So to be converted is a cooperative effort between God and man, who each do a part and bring to a person to salvation, to conversion. The result of that, according to that 9th rejection, is, quote, that grace does not precede, in the order of causality, the effective influence of the will. So for all the remonstrant talk of prevenient grace, grace that goes before, they didn't actually believe that grace was effective and effectual. In the Council of Orange, then, the Synod of Orange, there's a concluding little definition of faith that says, and I'm just summarizing here, because Adam's sin so impaired and weakened free will, no one can either love God as he ought, believe in God, or do good for God's sake, unless the grace of divine mercy has preceded him. So it's more than just a concurrent, partial thing. Back to the canons, they summarize that remonstrant error by saying, quote, that God does not effectively help the human will to come to conversion before that will itself motivates, determines itself. And in contrast, back to Orange, Council of Orange spoke of God's grace in baptism as changing man for the better, in contrast to how the sin of Adam changed him for the worse. And so there's this grace that not merely goes before and is available for our will to cooperate with, but it actually does something. It makes a person better, in contrast to how the sin of Adam has done something to make us for the worse. I'll skip. I've got a bunch of more references here, but that gives a little bit, hopefully a little bit of the sense. Well, I'll just mention one more. Third and fourth point of doctrine, Article 7, really interesting connection. And I should mention, there's a lot of these references in the various judgments of the delegations against the remonstrants, and just more study needs to be done, tracking those references down, and also tracking out the linguistic commonality, and are they actually citing from these canons. But in Article 7 of the third and fourth point of doctrine, it speaks about the prophets preaching of the Messiah to come. And the canons say, quote, this mystery of his will God revealed to but a small number under the Old Testament. But in contrast, under the New Covenant, the distinction between various peoples having been removed, he reveals himself to many without any distinction of people. Now the boundaries of Israel have been removed. Why does God reveal his will to many in the New Covenant? The cause of this dispensation is not to be ascribed to the superior worth of one nation above another, nor to their making a better use of the light of nature, but results wholly from the sovereign good pleasure and unmerited love of God. And it's interesting that in the Council of Orange, in their concluding definition of faith, they also make this connection between Old and New covenants in terms of grace and will and so forth, and sin, when it says this, quote, through the sin of Adam, free choice has been so weakened that we cannot love God as we ought, believe in him, or do good works unless God's grace precedes. And then here's the phrase, this was true of the patriarchs before the coming of Christ, and is true after of us, so that the desire to be baptized comes not from free choice, but the bounty of Christ. So they're thinking in similar covenantal, we would say, terms, Old New Covenant terms, redemptive historical terms, that the way that God works now is the same way he's always worked, by the power of his grace. Why does this matter? So I said I wanted to think about Catholicity. So why does this matter? Again, far from being a Reformed distinctive, if you're not in a Reformed church that uses that language, just bear with me for a moment. But we think of the so-called 5 points of Calvinism as our distinctive doctrines. I'm saying that far from being a Reformed distinctive, Dort's doctrine of sin and grace and his third and fourth point of doctrine is a faithful appropriation and application of ancient Augustinian Catholicity as it was expressed at the Council of Orange. Why does this matter? Well, as a pastor, I'll just give three quick, three little applications. First of all, this matters. It helps us to recapture, reassess, and re-receive our forefathers' mindset that we as historic Protestants are just a continuation of the Catholic Church. That's what they believed. What does Calvin call his liturgy? The form of prayers according to the custom of the Reformation Church? Swiss Church? Dutch Church? No. The ancient church. So they have this mindset that Protestantism is not a new church, but it's a continuation of the Catholic Church. It's one thing. Secondly, this helps us proclaim more loudly that our doctrines are Christian doctrines. They're not our doctrines. These are Christian doctrines. It was the Remonstrants who put forward 5 points. The Synod merely responded with counterpoints. This means that what we believe as Reformed churches is not summarized in the canons or that overly modern, overly simplified acronym TULIP. That's a product of the early 20th century. It actually reorders the points themselves. What's the Dutch word for tulip? Tulp, right? So I'm not sure how they would get to tulip. So that's another, is that these are Christian doctrines. So we have the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgian Confession of Faith. The canons are responding to teaching in error, but they don't summarize our faith. They don't summarize our faith. But even when they respond, they are seeking to be Catholic, Christian in their presentation. Finally, this helps us as Reformed people, frozen chosen types, right? The distinctive, we live in our little corners of the world, Northwest Iowa, right? The Kuyperian experiment par excellence, right? So we have our little corners of the world. This helps us cultivate. This helps us cultivate a more generous, a more Catholic spirit. And maybe that's just something that strikes me because I live on the beach. And, I don't have the benefit of having multiple generations of people being born into my church. Or people that just live in the nearest, second, third, fourth, fifth Reformed church down the street. So being more generous, being more Catholic. The canons are a moderate, a mediating document to unify various churches, Reformed expressions across that 17th century world. So teaching us to be not stuck in a corner, not insular, not the cage phase Calvinist. You know what the cage phase Calvinist is? The guy like me who is a Roman Catholic, becomes a charismatic, a Pentecostal, then becomes Reformed and is like a rabid barking dog and is attacking everybody all the time. And you put him in a cage, as a pastor, you put him in a cage for a year. You tell them to come to church, but after church, put them in a cage in the corner and tell them not to talk to anybody, right? Don't talk to anyone for a year. Just stay in your cage until you simmer down a little bit, right? And so we want to be Catholic. We want to be generous. We want to be full of love. So thus endeth the lesson. 23 minutes. I'm just getting warmed up,
I know.
That's like a sermon introduction
We
for
might
you.
have put you in a cage.